Sometimes the hardest thing about growing older is watching your purpose slip away like snow through your fingers. Marshal Everett Blake knew that feeling all too well at 63, spending his days in the quiet mountain town of Cedar Ridge, wondering if he'd outlived his usefulness. Then they found her in the snow, a mysterious woman barely alive, speaking words that made strong men cross themselves and look away. The townsfolk whispered she was the caged mountain woman, a spirit that appeared when old secrets needed settling. They locked her up and warned Everett to stay clear, but something in her eyes called to him. Against everyone's warnings, he started bringing her food, listening to her strange words about betrayals from long ago. Now she speaks only to him, and she won't let him walk away. What truth is she protecting that could change everything he thought he knew? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted Cedar Ridge in shades of amber and gold, casting long shadows between the weathered buildings that lined Main Street. Marshal Everett Blake stood on the wooden porch of his office, a cup of black coffee steaming in his weathered hands, watching the town wake up with the same deliberate pace it had maintained for the past 40 years. At 63, he'd seen this same sunrise more times than he cared to count, each one marking another day in a life that had somehow stretched longer than he'd expected. The town hadn't changed much since he'd first pinned on the Marshal's badge in 1885. The same false front. Buildings housed the same types of businesses. Henderson's medical practice, Caldwell's general store, Martha's saloon, and the assayer's office that saw less business each year as the silver played out in the surrounding mountains. The railroad had bypassed Cedar Ridge decades ago, leaving it to exist in a pocket of time where progress moved as slowly as molasses in January. Everett's office sat at the heart of it all, a sturdy log building with thick walls and barred windows that had housed the town's law for over 50 years. The jail cells in the back had seen their share of drunks, claim jumpers, and the occasional horse thief, but nothing that had tested his mettle in years. These days, his biggest challenges involved mediating disputes between neighbors over property lines or breaking up the occasional fight at Martha's when the whiskey flowed too freely. The marshal's badge on his vest had lost its shine years ago, the silver star now bearing the patina of age and countless storms weathered. Sometimes he caught himself polishing it absent-mindedly, remembering when it had meant something more than just keeping the peace between folks who'd known each other their entire lives. There had been a time when wearing that badge meant facing down real danger, when his reputation had extended beyond the borders of this small mountain community. Morning, Marshal. Doc Henderson's voice broke through his reverie as the physician made his way down the street, medical bag in hand, probably headed to check on Mrs. Patterson's rheumatism again. At 72, Henderson was one of the few people in town older than Everett, and his steady presence had been a constant through all the changes the years had brought. Morning, Doc. Early rounds today? You know how it is. Arthritis doesn't keep banker's hours. Henderson paused at the foot of the porch steps, his kind eyes studying Everett's face with the practiced gaze of a man who'd spent a lifetime reading the subtle signs of human suffering. You've been looking thoughtful lately, Everett. Something weighing on your mind? Everett took a slow sip of his coffee, considering the question. There was something, though he couldn't quite name it. A restlessness that had been growing stronger with each passing month, a sense that his life was winding down without having accomplished anything truly significant. Just wondering if I've overstayed my welcome in this job, I suppose. Nonsense. This town needs you, has needed you for 40 years. Don't go getting ideas about retirement just because your bones creak a little more in the morning. The sound of boots on wooden planks announced another early riser. Mayor Jeremiah Caldwell approached from the direction of his store, his portly frame moving with the self-important gait of a man who believed his own rhetoric about civic duty. At 55, Caldwell had been mayor for the past 15 years, inheriting both the position and the general store from his father, just as his father had inherited them from his father before him. Gentleman, Caldwell nodded, slightly out of breath from his walk. Beautiful morning, isn't it? Though I heard some concerning news from the night watch. Apparently, there was some kind of disturbance up near Widow's Peak last evening. Strange lights, they said, and sounds that didn't seem natural. Everett and Henderson exchanged glances. Widow's Peak sat about 5 miles north of town, a forbidding outcrop of granite that had earned its name from the number of men who died trying to work the treacherous silver veins that ran through it. The mine had been abandoned for over a decade, deemed too dangerous to continue operations after a series of cave-ins and accidents. What kind of sounds? Everett asked, though he suspected the answer would involve too much whiskey and too little sleep on the part of whoever had reported it. Well, that's just it. Nobody could quite describe them. Jenkins was out checking his trap lines and swears he heard something like singing, but not in any language he recognized. Said it made his hair stand on end. Doc Henderson chuckled softly. Jenkins has been known to sample his own moonshine while checking those traps. I wouldn't put too much stock in. His words were cut off by the sound of shouting from the far end of Main Street. The 3 men turned to see a small crowd gathering near the edge of town, their voices carrying a note of excitement and fear that raised the hair on Everett's neck. Without a word, he set down his coffee cup and started walking toward the commotion, Henderson and Caldwell falling into step beside him. The crowd parted as they approached, revealing the source of the disturbance. Young Tom Morrison, barely 18 and eager to prove himself as a prospector, knelt in the muddy street beside a makeshift travois made from pine branches and his own coat. But it wasn't Tom that drew their attention. It was what he'd found. A woman lay unconscious on the improvised stretcher, her dark hair matted with snow and ice, her skin pale as mountain granite. She wore clothes that seemed both familiar and strange, buckskin pants and a wool coat that might have been fashionable decades ago, but cut in a style Everett didn't recognize. Her feet were bare, though the morning temperature couldn't have been much above freezing, and her hands were stained with what looked like dried blood. Found her about 2 miles up the North Trail, Tom explained, his voice shaking with excitement and something that might have been fear. Thought she was dead at first, but she's breathing, barely, been muttering things in her sleep. But I can't make sense of any of it. Doc Henderson knelt beside the woman, his professional instincts taking over as he checked her pulse and examined her for obvious injuries. She's hypothermic, probably been out there all night. Help me get her to my office. Now hold on just a minute, Caldwell interjected, his voice carrying the authority he believed came with his position. We don't know anything about this woman, where she came from, what she might have done. For all we know, she could be dangerous. The crowd murmured agreement, and Everett could see the fear beginning to spread among the gathered townspeople. He'd seen it before, the way uncertainty could quickly turn to suspicion when people were confronted with something they didn't understand. She's half dead, Jeremiah, Doc Henderson said firmly. Whatever else she might be, right now she's a human being who needs medical attention. As if summoned by their voices, the woman's eyes suddenly opened. They were the color of storm clouds, gray with flecks of silver that seemed to catch and hold the morning light. Her gaze swept over the assembled faces before settling on Everett, and when their eyes met, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a jolt of recognition. Though he was certain he'd never seen her before in his life, her lips moved, barely audible words escaping in a whisper that somehow carried clearly through the morning air. The 3 who made the pact. They're still here, still bleeding the mountain dry. Then her eyes rolled back and she fell unconscious again, leaving the crowd standing in stunned silence. What did she mean by that? Someone asked, but no one had an answer. Doc Henderson looked up from his examination. Whatever it means, it can wait. Right now, she needs warmth and medical attention, or she won't be saying anything else to anyone. Caldwell stepped forward, his face flushed with authority and something that might have been genuine concern. I'm not comfortable with bringing an unknown person into town, Doc. Not after what Tom said about her muttering strange things. What if she's unwell? Mentally disturbed? Then she needs help even more, Henderson replied sharply. I took an oath, Jeremiah, and I intend to honor it. Everett found himself studying the woman's face as the debate continued around him. There was something about her features, something that nagged at the edges of his memory like a half-remembered dream. The high cheekbones, the strong jaw, the way her dark hair fell across her forehead, it all seemed familiar, though he couldn't place why. "She'll stay in the jail," he heard himself saying, and was surprised by the firmness in his own voice. "Doc can treat her there, and we can keep an eye on her until we know more about her situation." "The jail?" Henderson protested. "Everett, she's not a criminal. She's an unknown," Everett replied, though even as he said it, he wasn't entirely sure he believed it himself. "Until we know who she is and where she came from. The jail is the safest place for everyone concerned." The crowd seemed to approve of this compromise, and within minutes they had carefully transported the unconscious woman to the marshal's office. As Henderson worked to stabilize her condition, Everett found himself staring at an old document that hung framed on his office wall, the original town charter from 1847, signed by the three founding families, Caldwell, Henderson, and Morrison. The weathered parchment had always been just a piece of local history, but now something about it troubled him. The woman's words echoed in his mind. The three who made the pact. Could she have been referring to the founding families? But that was nearly 80 years ago, and the woman couldn't have been older than 35. It made no sense, yet something about the coincidence made his stomach tighten with unease. As Doc Henderson finished his initial examination and declared the woman stable but still unconscious, Everett made a decision that would change the course of his quiet life forever. Against the protests of Mayor Caldwell, and despite the suspicious murmurs of the townspeople, he had the woman moved to the most comfortable cell in the jail, with Henderson's promise to check on her regularly. That evening, as the sun set behind the western peaks and cast Cedar Ridge into shadow, Everett found himself unable to concentrate on his usual evening routine. He kept returning to the jail cells, ostensibly to check on his unusual prisoner, but really to study her sleeping face and try to understand why she seemed so familiar. The woman, for he had no other name to call her, lay on the simple cot he'd provided, covered with his own wool blanket. In sleep, she looked younger, more vulnerable, but there was still something about her that spoke of hidden strength and deeper mysteries. Her breathing was steady now, and some color had returned to her cheeks, but she remained unconscious, lost in whatever dreams or memories occupied her mind. As Everett stood watching her through the cell bars, he couldn't shake the feeling that her arrival marked the end of something, his comfortable, predictable life, and the beginning of something else entirely. Something that would test not just his skills as a lawman, but his understanding of justice, truth, and the weight of the past on the present. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the gaps in the log walls with a sound that was almost but not quite like human voices. And in her sleep, the mysterious woman began to speak again. Words too soft to understand, but carrying a tone that made Everett's blood run cold with their mixture of sorrow and ancient anger. Tomorrow, he would begin trying to uncover the truth about his unexpected prisoner. Tonight, he would stand guard and wonder what forces he had set in motion by his simple act of compassion. 3 days passed before Everett finally worked up the courage to bring the woman her first proper meal. Doc Henderson had been providing basic medical care, checking her pulse, monitoring her temperature, ensuring she stayed hydrated, but the woman had remained unconscious, lost in whatever deep sleep had claimed her since Tom Morrison found her in the snow. The townspeople had grown increasingly agitated during those 3 days. Rumors spread through Cedar Ridge like wildfire in dry timber. The woman was a witch, a madwoman, a harbinger of some unnamed disaster. Mayor Caldwell had visited the jail twice, each time suggesting more forcefully that they should either send her away or contact the territorial authorities. But something kept Everett from acting on these suggestions, some instinct that told him the woman's presence in their town was no accident. On the morning of the 4th day, Everett made his decision. He prepared a simple meal, hot oatmeal, fresh bread and coffee, and carried it to the jail on a wooden tray. His hands trembled slightly as he unlocked the cell door, though whether from age or nervousness, he couldn't say. The woman was sitting upright on the cot when he entered, her storm-grey eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made him pause in the doorway. She had been waiting for him, he realized. How long had she been conscious? "You fed the wolf," she said, her voice carrying the hint of an accent he couldn't place. "Now you belong to the pack." Everett set the tray on the small table beside her cot, his marshal's instincts telling him to be careful, even as his human compassion urged him to help her. "I brought you some food. Doc Henderson says you need to eat to get your strength back." She didn't look at the food. Her gaze remained fixed on his face, as if she were reading something written there in a language only she could understand. "You don't remember me, do you, Everett Blake?" The use of his name stopped him cold. He was certain he'd never introduced himself, and Doc Henderson had been careful not to mention names in front of her. "How do you know my name?" A smile played at the corners of her mouth, but it held no warmth. "I know many things about you. I know you've worn that badge for 40 years, thinking you were keeping the peace. I know you lie awake at night wondering if your life has mattered. I know you feel the weight of something you can't name, some guilt that's been eating at you like a cancer." Everett's hand instinctively moved to his gun, though he made no move to draw it. "Who are you? Where do you come from?" Instead of answering, she reached beneath her shirt and pulled out something that made Everett's breath catch in his throat. It was a pendant carved from what looked like bone, intricate symbols etched into its surface with painstaking detail. The craftsmanship was unlike anything he'd ever seen, but the symbols themselves seemed familiar, like half-remembered nightmares. "Your people call this cursed land?" she said, holding the pendant up so the light from the barred window played across its surface. "They built their town on bones and blood, on promises broken and trust betrayed. This pendant has been in my family for 6 generations, passed down through the women who survived what your founders did to us." My founders. Everett felt the first stirrings of genuine unease. "Lady, I don't know what you're talking about, don't you?" Her eyes blazed with sudden fury. "Don't you remember the stories your grandfather told you about the early days? About how the 3 founding families came to own the richest silver deposits in the territory? About how they dealt with the Indian problem so efficiently?" The pendant seemed to pulse in her hand, and Everett could have sworn he felt a corresponding pulse in his own chest, like an echo of his heartbeat. The symbols on the bone became clearer, more distinct, and with growing horror, he recognized them as the same markings he'd seen carved into trees around the abandoned mines. The same symbols that appeared on certain rocks near Widow's Peak. "You're talking about things that happened before I was born," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. There had been stories, whispered tales his grandfather had shared during long winter evenings, but Everett had always assumed they were just the exaggerated yarns old-timers told to pass the time. "Before you were born, yes, but not before your blood was marked by what happened here." She leaned forward, and her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Tell me, Marshal Blake, why do you think Cedar Ridge has been so peaceful? All these years, why do you think no major disasters have struck this town, no epidemics, no mine collapses that killed everyone involved?" Everett wanted to say it was just luck, good management, the natural isolation that protected mountain communities from many of the problems that plagued larger settlements. But even as the words formed in his mind, he knew they weren't true. Cedar Ridge had been remarkably blessed over the decades, almost unnaturally so. "It's because the debt hasn't come due yet," the woman continued. "Because the spirits of my people have been waiting, watching, keeping this place safe until the right time came for justice to be served." As if summoned by her words, the temperature in the jail cell dropped noticeably. Everett's breath began to mist in the suddenly frigid air, and frost started forming on the metal bars, despite the warmth of the autumn morning outside. "This is impossible," Everett muttered. But even as he spoke, he saw movement in his peripheral vision. Shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source. Shapes that suggested human forms, but dissolved when he tried to look at them directly. "You feel it now, don't you?" the woman said, and there was something almost like pity in her voice. The weight of what your bloodline carries, the debt that was never paid. Everett's hand moved to his chest, where a dull ache had begun to spread outward from his heart. It felt like grief, like loss, but magnified beyond anything he'd ever experienced. Images flashed through his mind, scenes that couldn't be his own memories, but felt as real as his own life. Men with torches surrounding a peaceful encampment, the glint of silver and steel in moonlight, the screams of women and children echoing off canyon walls. "No!" he gasped, staggering backward until his shoulders hit the cell wall. "These aren't my memories. They're not your memories," the woman agreed. "They're mine, my family's, the memories of those who died so your town could prosper." She stood up from the cot, moving with a fluid grace that seemed at odds with her recent condition. "I am Ayanna, last daughter of the Singing Wolf clan, keeper of the old promises, and guardian of the debt that must be paid." The name hit Everett like a physical blow. Ayanna. He had heard that name before, in his grandfather's stories, in the half-remembered tales of the town's founding. But it was impossible. Those stories were from 80 years ago, and this woman couldn't be more than 35. "You can't be," he whispered. "She would be. She would have died decades ago." Ayanna's smile was sad now, touched with genuine sorrow. "Death is not always the end, Marshal Blake. Sometimes it's just the beginning of a longer duty." She moved closer to the bars, and Everett could see now that her eyes held depths that spoke of far more years than her face suggested. "I've been waiting, learning, preparing, and now the time has come." The time for what? For the 3 families to pay their debt, for the truth about Cedar Ridge to come to light, for justice to be served one way or another. As she spoke, the supernatural cold in the cell intensified, and Everett heard something that made his blood freeze. Voices carried on the wind outside, speaking in a language he didn't recognize but somehow understood. They were calling for justice, for vengeance, for the settling of old accounts. "What do you want from me?" he asked, though part of him already knew the answer. "I want you to help me," Ayanna said simply. "I want you to prove that there's still honor in that badge you wear, that justice means more to you than protecting the comfortable lies this town was built on." "And if I refuse?" Her expression hardened, and for a moment, Everett caught a glimpse of something terrible in her eyes, a fury that had been building for generations, a hunger for retribution that went beyond human emotion. "Then this town will learn what happens when debts go unpaid for too long," she said. "The spirits of my people grow restless, Marshal Blake. They've been patient, but patience is not infinite. Help me find justice, or watch as justice finds this place on its own terms." As if to emphasize her words, somewhere in the distance a wolf howled, a sound that shouldn't have been possible in the bright morning sunlight, but echoed clearly through the mountain air nonetheless. The rest of that day passed in a haze of disbelief and growing dread for Everett Blake. He'd left Ayanna's cell without another word, his mind reeling from her revelations and the impossible supernatural events he'd witnessed. The rational part of him insisted it had all been some kind of trick, perhaps the result of the altitude or too much coffee on an empty stomach. But his hand still shook when he remembered the bone-deep cold and the shadows that moved with purpose. That evening, long after the sun had set behind the western peaks, Everett found himself in his small office, pulling out records he hadn't examined in decades. The town's historical documents were kept in a locked cabinet behind his desk. Deeds, birth certificates, death records, and most importantly, the original land grants and purchase agreements from the territorial government. By lamplight, he spread the documents across his desk, looking for any reference to the native peoples who had lived in this area before Cedar Ridge's founding. What he found made his stomach tighten with unease. The land purchase record showed that the 3 founding families, Caldwell, Henderson, and Morrison, had acquired nearly 10,000 acres for a fraction of its value. The paperwork indicated they had negotiated directly with local tribal representatives, but there were no details about these negotiations. No signatures from any native leaders, no witness statements or documentation of tribal consent. More troubling still was a document he'd never noticed before. Filed separately from the main records, it was a report from the Territorial Marshal's office, dated 6 months after Cedar Ridge's founding, regarding an investigation into disturbances in the area. The report mentioned unconfirmed accounts of a settlement dispute resulting in casualties, but concluded that no evidence of wrongdoing could be established, and the matter was considered closed. Everett rubbed his tired eyes and reached for another folder. This one contained the town's early newspaper clippings, preserved between sheets of tissue paper. Most were routine announcements, births, deaths, business openings. But one headline from 1848 caught his attention: "Local prosperity continues despite regional unrest." The article was brief, but it mentioned that Cedar Ridge had remained remarkably peaceful, while other settlements in the territory dealt with native uprisings and mining disputes. The writer attributed this to the wise leadership of the founding families and their successful negotiations with local interests. A soft knock on his office door interrupted his research. Everett looked up to see Tom Morrison standing in the doorway, his hat in his hands and worry etched across his young face. "Marshal Blake, I'm sorry to bother you so late, but I've been having trouble sleeping since I found that woman. Been thinking about some things, and I wondered if I could talk to you." Everett gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Of course, Tom, what's on your mind?" The young prospector sat down heavily, his eyes drawn to the document spread across the desk. "Is that stuff about the town's early days? Because that's sort of what I wanted to talk about." "What about it?" Tom shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Well, it's probably nothing. But after I brought that woman to town, I got to thinking about where I found her. It was up near the old Morrison claims, you know? The ones my great-grandfather worked back in the 50s. Everett felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. "Go on." "The thing is, Marshal, I've been up in those hills my whole life, and I've never seen anything like what I saw that morning. There were marks carved into the rocks around where I found her. Symbols, like. And the strangest thing was, they looked fresh, but they were cut deep into stone that would take years to carve." Tom reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper. "I sketched some of them, thinking maybe you'd know what they meant." Everett took the paper and felt his breath catch. The symbols Tom had drawn were crude but recognizable. They matched the markings on Ayana's bone pendant perfectly. "Tom, I need you to think carefully about this. Was there anything else unusual about that area? Anything that seemed off?" The young man nodded slowly. "That's the other thing I wanted to tell you about. The ground up there around where I found her." It was warm. Not just warmer than it should have been for an autumn morning, but actually warm, like something was heating it from underneath. And there were no animal tracks anywhere nearby, which is strange because that area usually has plenty of deer sign. Everett studied the sketches again, his mind racing. If Tom was telling the truth, then Ayana's appearance wasn't random. She had been found at a place that held significance. A place marked with the same symbol she carried. "Tom, I want you to do me a favor. Don't mention these symbols to anyone else in town just yet. And maybe avoid going back up to that area for a while. You think there's something dangerous up there?" Everett met the young man's eyes. "I think there are things about this town's history that we don't fully understand. And until we do, it's better to be cautious." After Tom left, Everett returned to his research with renewed urgency. He pulled out the oldest documents in the collection, the personal papers of the town's first marshal, a man named Samuel Crawford. Crawford had served Cedar Ridge for only 2 years before mysteriously disappearing in 1849, leaving behind a collection of official reports and personal notes that had been stored in the marshal's office ever since. Most of Crawford's reports were routine, but his personal notes told a different story. In them, Crawford had recorded his growing suspicions about the founding families and their claims to the land around Cedar Ridge. He wrote of disturbing accounts from territorial traders about a violent confrontation between settlers and natives that had supposedly been resolved peacefully. One entry, dated just weeks before Crawford's disappearance, was particularly chilling. The Henderson boy let something slip today about his grandfather's war stories. Mentioned silver and blood in the same breath, then clammed up when he saw I was listening. I've been asking around, careful-like, about what really happened when the first family settled here. Nobody wants to talk about it directly, but I'm getting pieces of a story that doesn't match the official version. There's something buried in this town's past, something dark, and I aim to find out what it is. The final entry in Crawford's journal was dated the day before his disappearance. Found something up at Widow's Peak today. Old campsite? Looks like it was burned out years ago. Found bones too, human bones. More than could have come from any normal mining accident. And carved into a boulder near the site were symbols I've never seen before, but they felt familiar somehow, like something from a nightmare. I think I know now what happened to the people who lived here before us. God help us all if I'm right. Everett set down the journal with shaking hands. The pattern was becoming clearer, and it painted a picture of his town that turned his stomach. The founding families hadn't negotiated for the land. They had taken it by force, apparently killing the native inhabitants and covering up their crime with falsified documents and bribes. But if that was true, then Ayana's claims about supernatural justice weren't the ravings of a madwoman. They were the promise of a reckoning that had been decades in the making. As if summoned by his thoughts, he heard a sound from the direction of the jail cells. Ayana's voice, speaking in that unknown language he'd heard earlier. Her words carried clearly through the walls, rising and falling in what sounded almost like a chant or prayer. Outside, the temperature was dropping again, and somewhere in the distance, that impossible wolf howl echoed through the mountain air once more. The disappearance of Tommy Morrison sent shockwaves through Cedar Ridge that no amount of official reassurance could calm. It had been 3 days since anyone had seen the young prospector, and despite organized search parties combing every inch of the surrounding mountains, they'd found no trace of him, no abandoned camp, no scattered equipment, no sign that he had ever existed at all. Everett stood at the edge of the search area near the old Morrison claims, staring at the place where Tommy had found Ayana just over a week ago. The symbols Tom had sketched were still there, carved deep into the granite outcroppings, but something about them had changed. They seemed more prominent now, darker, as if they had been filled in with fresh charcoal or soot. "Any luck, Marshal?" Doc Henderson's voice came from behind him, tired and strained from 3 days of hiking through rough terrain. Everett turned to face the older man, noting the deep lines of worry etched around his eyes. "Nothing. It's like he just vanished into thin air." Henderson joined him at the rocky outcrop, studying the carved symbols with a mixture of curiosity and unease. "These markings, they're not natural, are they?" "No, they're not." Everett ran his fingers along one of the carved lines, surprised to find it warm to the touch despite the cool morning air. Tom sketched these same symbols the night before he disappeared. He said they looked fresh but cut into old stone. That's impossible. "Stone carving like this would take months, maybe years," Everett finished. "I know, but here they are." The two men stood in uncomfortable silence, both thinking the same thought but neither wanting to voice it. The woman in the jail had somehow known Tommy would disappear, had spoken of debts coming due and justice being served. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence. "Everett," Henderson said quietly, "I need to tell you something about our prisoner. Something I probably should have mentioned before." The marshal turned to face his old friend fully. "What kind of something?" "Medical things. Things that don't make sense." Henderson pulled a small notebook from his jacket pocket, his patient notes. "I've been documenting her condition since we brought her in, and the readings I'm getting are unusual." "Unusual how?" "Her body temperature, for one thing. It runs consistently low, 94 degrees, instead of the normal 98.6. Her pulse is slower than it should be, only about 50 beats per minute, but strong and steady. And her breathing," Henderson shook his head. "I've timed it multiple times. She takes exactly 6 breaths per minute while sleeping. No variation. Everett felt the familiar chill of unease creeping up his spine. What does that mean? In my professional opinion, it means she shouldn't be alive. Those vital signs would indicate someone in the final stages of hypothermia, someone on the verge of death. But she's alert, responsive, stronger than she should be after what she's been through. The sound of horses approaching interrupted their conversation. Mayor Caldwell rode up with 3 other men, members of the town council who had been growing increasingly vocal about their concerns regarding the mysterious woman in the jail. Marshal Blake. Caldwell called out as he dismounted. "We need to talk." The other council members, Frank Patterson, who ran the hardware store, Bill Hayes from the mining office, and Jonathan Wheeler, who owned the lumber mill, formed a loose semicircle around Everett and Henderson. Their faces were grim, and Everett could see the fear and suspicion that had been building in town for the past several days. "We've been discussing the situation," Caldwell continued, "and we think it's time to take decisive action regarding our guest." "What kind of action?" Everett asked, though he suspected he already knew. "She needs to go," Patterson said bluntly. "This town has been peaceful for decades, and now within a week of her arrival, we have a missing person and strange things happening that nobody can explain." "What strange things?" Henderson asked. Wheeler stepped forward. "My mill hands are reporting that their tools are going missing, then turning up in impossible places, hammers embedded in tree trunks 30 feet up, saws found perfectly balanced on thin branches that couldn't support their weight. And the horses in town are spooked, refusing to go near certain areas, especially anywhere near the jail." "That's not all," Hayes added. "The temperature readings at the mining office show massive fluctuations that don't match anything we're seeing with our instruments. Yesterday afternoon, the thermometer outside my window showed 15 degrees below freezing for exactly 1 hour, then jumped back to normal. But when I stepped outside during that time, the air felt normal." Caldwell nodded grimly. "And then there's the matter of the voices." "Voices!" Everett felt his stomach tighten. "People are hearing things, Marshal. Voices speaking in unknown languages. Coming from empty buildings, from the forest at night, even from inside their own homes when they know they're alone." Everett exchanged a meaningful look with Henderson. The doctor had gone pale, and his hands were trembling slightly as he closed his notebook. "There's more," Caldwell continued. "Martha found something this morning that has the whole town on edge." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a leather pouch, handling it like it might explode at any moment. "She discovered this hanging from the sign outside her saloon. Nobody saw who put it there." The mayor opened the pouch and poured its contents into his palm. A collection of small bones tumbled out. Bird bones, Everett realized, but arranged in a pattern that made his skin crawl. They had been carved with the same symbols that marked the rocks around them, and they were bound together with what looked like human hair. "This is some kind of witchcraft," Patterson said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Evil spirits and curses. That woman has brought something terrible to our town." Henderson stepped closer to examine the bones, his medical training overriding his obvious discomfort. "These are precisely carved," he observed. "The work of someone with considerable skill and knowledge. But I've never seen anything like the symbols. You know what I think?" Wheeler said, his voice gaining strength from shared fear. "I think young Tommy Morrison stumbled onto something he shouldn't have when he found that woman. I think whatever got him is still out there, and it won't stop with just one person." Everett felt the weight of leadership settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. These were good men he'd known and respected for years, but they were driven by fear of the unknown into making decisions that could have terrible consequences. "Gentlemen," he said carefully, "I understand your concerns, but we can't just abandon our principles because we're frightened by things we don't understand." "Principles." Caldwell's voice rose. "Everett, this isn't about principles anymore. This is about survival. That woman, whatever she is, has brought something dark to Cedar Ridge, and it's only going to get worse if we don't act." "Act how exactly?" Henderson asked. "She's done nothing illegal. We have no proof she's responsible for any of these incidents." "No proof?" Hayes laughed bitterly. Doc, with all due respect, the proof is all around us. Strange weather, missing persons, supernatural disturbances, all starting the moment she arrived, as if summoned by their conversation. A wind began to rise around them, despite the fact that the trees in every other direction stood perfectly still. The temperature dropped noticeably, and somewhere in the distance they could hear the sound that had become all too familiar over the past week. Wolf howls that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "She has to go," Caldwell said firmly. "Tonight. Either she leaves voluntarily, or we escort her to the territorial boundary and make sure she keeps going." "And if she refuses?" Everett asked. The 5 council members looked at each other, and Everett saw a hardness in their eyes that chilled him more than any supernatural phenomenon. "Then we'll do what our grandfathers should have done 80 years ago," Patterson said quietly. "We'll protect this town by whatever means necessary." The threat hung in the air between them, like smoke from a funeral pyre. Everett realized that his quiet mountain community was fracturing along lines of fear and desperation, and that the woman in his jail had somehow catalyzed conflicts that went deeper than anyone wanted to admit. "I won't be part of vigilante justice," he said firmly. "If you want her removed, you'll need to go through proper legal channels." "Legal channels?" Wheeler laughed harshly. "Everett, the nearest territorial judge is 200 miles away, and by the time we could get a hearing, half the town might be dead or missing. Sometimes a man has to choose between what's legal and what's right." As the men remounted their horses and prepared to leave, Caldwell turned back to Everett with an expression of genuine regret. "I've known you for 20 years, Marshal Blake, and I've always respected your commitment to the law. But this situation is beyond normal law. That woman knows things about this town, about our families, that she shouldn't know. Things that could destroy everything our grandfathers built here." "What kind of things?" Caldwell's face went pale. "The kind of things that are better left buried. Give her up, Everett. Let us handle this our way, and we can all go back to the peaceful lives we've built here." After the council members rode away, Everett and Henderson stood alone among the carved stones, both lost in their own thoughts about the ultimatum they'd just received. "They're scared," Henderson said finally. "Scared enough to do something they'll regret for the rest of their lives. The question is," Everett replied, staring at the mysterious symbols carved into the granite, "are they scared of what she might do, or are they scared of what she might reveal?" As they made their way back toward town, neither man noticed the fresh symbols that had appeared on the rocks behind them, or the way the carved bones in Caldwell's pouch had begun to glow with a faint, otherworldly light. That night, unable to sleep and haunted by the town council's ultimatum, Everett found himself back in his office, digging deeper into the historical records he'd only begun to examine. The lamplight flickered across the documents spread before him, casting dancing shadows that seemed almost alive. In his peripheral vision, it was nearly midnight when he found it, hidden behind the back panel of his predecessor's desk drawer was a compartment, so well concealed that it had escaped notice for decades. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather, was a journal bound in cracked brown leather. The name embossed on the cover made his hands tremble. Samuel Crawford. Marshal. Crawford's hidden journal was different from his official reports, more personal, more honest, and infinitely more disturbing. The entries began normally enough, routine observations about the town and its residents. But as Crawford had delved deeper into Cedar Ridge's origins, his writing had become increasingly urgent and fearful. The entry that stopped Everett's breath was dated September 15th, 1849. "I have uncovered the truth about our town's founding, and God help me, I wish I had remained ignorant. The official story that the 3 families negotiated peacefully with the local tribes for the land is a lie of the most damnable kind. The truth, as I have pieced it together from reluctant witnesses and physical evidence, is that in the winter of 1847, the Caldwell, Henderson, and Morrison families encountered a small band of native peoples camping in the valley we now call Cedar Ridge. These people, members of what they called the Singing Wolf Clan, had been living there seasonally for generations, drawn by the natural hot springs and the rich silver deposits they considered sacred. The three families wanted both the land and the silver, but the natives refused all offers to sell or relocate. What happened next was not negotiation, it was slaughter. On a cold February night, the three families and their hired men surrounded the native camp and killed everyone they found. Men, women, children, elders, none were spared. The bodies were burned and the ashes scattered. The campsite was destroyed, and all evidence of the massacre was carefully concealed. But they made one crucial error. Unknown to the attackers, one young woman from the tribe was away from the camp that night, gathering medicinal herbs in the high country. She witnessed the massacre from a distance, saw her entire family and clan destroyed in a single night of violence and greed. Her name was Ayana, and she was the daughter of the clan's spiritual leader. She survived that winter alone in the mountains, sustained by grief and an unquenchable thirst for justice. By spring, she had begun what the local traders would only whisper about, a series of carefully planned attacks against the murderers and their families. One by one, the hired men who had participated in the massacre began to disappear. They were found days or weeks later, their bodies arranged in ritualistic patterns, marked with symbols carved into their flesh. The three families grew frightened and hired more guards, but Ayana seemed able to strike at will, appearing and vanishing like a ghost in the wilderness. The killing might have continued until every participant was dead, but fate intervened in an unexpected way. During a spring blizzard in 1848, Ayana was caught in an avalanche while pursuing one of her targets. Her body was never found, and after several months without further attacks, the three families assumed she had died. They were wrong. What I have discovered, through methods I dare not document even in this private journal, is that Ayana's hatred and grief were so powerful that death could not contain them. She has become something between the living and the dead, sustained by the need for justice and bound to this land until that justice is served. She appears to each generation, testing whether the descendants of the murderers will acknowledge their ancestors' crimes and make amends. If they refuse, as they have for the past 70 years, she waits, growing stronger, gathering the spirits of her murdered clan around her like an army of the dead. I believe she's been watching us all these years, learning our weaknesses, preparing for the final reckoning, and I fear that time is almost upon us. Everett's hands shook as he turned to the final entry in Crawford's journal. She came to me in a dream last night, or perhaps it was not a dream at all. Ayana appeared in my cell, for I am as much a prisoner of this truth as any man behind bars, and offered me the same choice she offers to every generation. Help her bring justice to the guilty, or watch as justice brings itself to the innocent along with the guilty. I have seen what she is capable of, the power she wields over the natural and supernatural world. If the three families continue to deny their ancestors' crimes, if they continue to profit from blood money while the spirits of the murdered cry out for justice, then Ayana will unleash forces that will destroy not just the guilty bloodlines, but everyone in Cedar Ridge. I cannot allow that to happen. I have decided to help her, to find a way to satisfy her need for justice while protecting the innocent. God willing, there is still time to prevent the catastrophe that approaches like a storm cloud on the horizon. If anyone finds this journal after my death, know that I tried to save this town. Know that the choice I made was made from love for the people I swore to protect. Even if they never understand the sacrifice that was required, the truth must be told. The debt must be paid. And may God have mercy on us all for the sins of our fathers. The journal ended there, and Everett realized he was holding his breath. Everything Crawford had written matched perfectly with what Ayana had told him, with the strange events that had been plaguing the town, with the supernatural phenomena that defied rational explanation. But there was one detail that made his blood run cold. Crawford had mentioned that Ayana offered her bargain to every generation. If that was true, than she had appeared to others over the years, marshals, perhaps, or other town leaders, and each time she had been refused. How many people had died because of those refusals? How many accidents and disappearances over the decades had actually been Ayanna's justice claiming its due? A soft sound from the jail cells interrupted his thoughts. Ayanna's voice, speaking in that liquid musical language he couldn't understand but felt in his bones. The words seemed to flow through the walls like water, carrying with them images and emotions that weren't his own. He saw the massacre as if he had witnessed it himself, the terror in the eyes of the victims, the cold calculation of the killers, the flames that consumed the evidence of their crime. He felt Ayanna's grief and rage, her desperate loneliness through decades of watching and waiting, her growing power as the spirits of her murdered family gathered around her seeking justice. And he understood, with crystalline clarity, that Crawford had been right about one thing. The final reckoning was approaching, and this time there would be no escape for anyone in Cedar Ridge unless the truth was acknowledged and the debt was finally paid. The question that remained was simple and terrifying. What price would justice demand? And would Everett have the courage to help pay it? Dawn came too soon and brought with it news that shattered what remained of Cedar Ridge's fragile peace. Doc Henderson was missing. Martha Kowalski, the saloon owner, had discovered the doctor's horse wandering loose near the old mining road, its saddle empty and its reins trailing in the dirt. A search of Henderson's house revealed signs of a hasty departure. His medical bag was gone, along with some personal items, but his money and valuable instruments remained untouched. More disturbing still were the symbols carved into his front door. The same mysterious markings that had been appearing throughout the town with increasing frequency. But these were different somehow, more elaborate, and they seemed to pulse with their own inner light even in the bright morning sun. Everett stood on Henderson's front porch, studying the carved symbols while Mayor Caldwell and several other town leaders voiced their mounting panic behind him. The markings were deeper than before, cut so precisely into the hardwood that they looked almost burned rather than carved. And in their center was something new, a symbol that resembled a wolf's head, surrounded by what looked like human figures arranged in a circle. "This is the third disappearance in less than a week," Caldwell was saying, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. "First Tommy, now Doc Henderson. How many more before you admit that woman is responsible?" Everett touched one of the carved lines and immediately jerked his hand back. The wood was warm, almost hot, despite the cool morning air. "Have any of you seen Doc Henderson with your own eyes since yesterday?" "What kind of question is that?" Frank Patterson demanded. "Of course we've seen him. He was making his rounds yesterday afternoon like always. Where exactly?" The men looked at each other uncertainly. Well, he was at the Wilson place checking on their sick baby," Wheeler offered. "And after that?" More uncertain glances. "I assumed he went home," Martha said quietly. "But now that I think about it, I don't actually remember seeing him after mid-afternoon." Everett felt the familiar chill of supernatural dread creeping up his spine. If Henderson had been taken during daylight hours from the center of town, and no one could remember seeing it happen, then they were dealing with something far beyond normal human capabilities. "We need to face facts," Caldwell said grimly. "That woman, whatever she is, has powers we don't understand. She's picking off members of this community one by one, and we're just standing around debating about it. Maybe she's not picking them off," Everett said quietly. "Maybe she's collecting them. What's the difference?" Everett turned away from the carved door to face the assembled group. Tommy Morrison was a descendant of one of the founding families. So is Doc Henderson. His grandfather was one of the original settlers. If Ayanna is seeking justice for crimes committed by the three founding families, then she's going after their bloodlines. The silence that greeted this observation was profound and terrible. Every person standing on that porch understood the implications immediately. If Everett was right, Then every descendant of the Caldwell, Henderson, and Morrison families was a potential target. "That's impossible," Caldwell whispered, but his face had gone ashen. "The crimes you're talking about happened 80 years ago. None of us had anything to do with whatever our grandfathers might have done." "Tell that to her," Everett replied, nodding toward the jail. "From what I've learned about Ayanna and her people, justice isn't limited by time. The sins of the fathers can be visited upon their children for generations." Martha Kowalski, who had been quietly studying the symbols on the door, suddenly spoke up. "Marshal, there's something I need to tell you all. Something I probably should have mentioned before." All eyes turned to the middle-aged woman, whose saloon had been the unofficial heart of Cedar Ridge's social life for over 20 years. "It's about the woman in your jail," Martha continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've seen her before." "That's impossible," Wheeler protested.
"She only arrived a week ago. No, you don't understand."
"I've seen her in dreams. For years now, maybe decades. Always the same woman, always wearing that bone pendant, always asking me the same questions about my family's history." Martha's revelation sent a shockwave through the group. Dreams were one thing, but if multiple people had been experiencing similar visions over the years, it suggested something far more systematic and long-term than anyone had imagined. "What kind of questions?" Everett asked. "About my great-grandfather, mostly. About the early days of the town, about how the original families acquired their land. In the dreams, she would show me things, terrible things, and ask me if I knew what my ancestors had done." "What kind of terrible things?" Martha's eyes filled with tears. "Violence, murder, families being slaughtered in the night. I always thought they were just nightmares, products of too much worry and not enough sleep. But seeing her now in person, I realized she was trying to tell me something important." Caldwell stepped closer to Martha, his voice urgent. "What else did she show you? What else do you remember?" "The last dream I had was different from the others. Instead of asking questions, she made a statement. She said the time for questions was over, that she was coming back to settle accounts once and for all." Martha looked directly at Everett. "That dream was the night before Tommy Morrison found her in the snow. The implications were staggering. If Ayanna had been appearing in dreams for years, preparing the ground for her return, then her arrival in Cedar Ridge was not chance or coincidence. It was the culmination of a plan that had been decades in the making." "There's something else," Martha added reluctantly. "In that last dream, she showed me something I'd never seen before. A silver medallion carved with symbols like the ones on your door. She said it was the key to ending the curse on our town, but that it would require a terrible sacrifice from someone who carried the blood of the guilty." Everett felt pieces of an enormous puzzle beginning to click into place in his mind. A sacred silver medallion, a curse that required blood sacrifice, disappearing descendants of the founding families. It all pointed toward some kind of ritual justice that went beyond simple revenge. "Where is this medallion?" he asked. "I don't know. In the dreams, she always kept it hidden, said it was too powerful to reveal until the time was right." Martha wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "But I got the feeling she had been protecting it for a very long time, waiting for the moment when she could use it to set things right." As if summoned by their conversation about her, the wind began to pick up around Henderson's house, swirling dust and leaves in patterns that seemed almost intentional. The temperature dropped noticeably, and somewhere in the distance they could hear the now familiar sound of wolves howling in broad daylight. But this time, the howling was different. Instead of the lone, mournful calls they had become accustomed to, this sounded like a pack, multiple voices raised together in what almost sounded like a song of mourning and rage. "She's calling them," Martha said softly. "The spirits of her people. They're gathering for the final confrontation." Everett looked around at the faces of his friends and neighbors, seeing fear and desperation etched in every line. These were good people, people who had lived their entire lives in this peaceful mountain community, never imagining that the foundations of their world had been built on violence and lies. "What do we do?" Caldwell asked quietly. Before Everett could answer, The symbols carved into Henderson's door began to glow with an eerie silver light, and Martha Kowalski suddenly stiffened, her eyes rolling back until only the whites were visible. When she spoke, it was not in her own voice but in the musical, haunting tones they had all learned to associate with Ayanna. The three who made the pact in blood must answer for their crime. The debt has grown with interest over the years, and payment is long overdue. Bring me the silver that was stolen from my people, acknowledge the truth of what was done, and perhaps mercy may still be found. But continue to hide behind lies and silence. And watch as your town pays the price your grandfathers should have paid long ago. Then Martha collapsed, and the glowing symbols faded back to ordinary carved wood, leaving the assembled group to stare at each other in terrified silence. That evening, alone in his office and shaken by Martha's supernatural possession, Everett found himself staring at a document he had overlooked in his earlier research. His own family Bible, the one that had sat on his desk for 40 years, without him giving it more than a passing glance. The leather binding was cracked with age, and the pages yellowed from decades of mountain air and lamplight. It had belonged to his father, and his father before him, passed down through the Blake family since they had arrived in the Colorado Territory. But tonight, something about it seemed different, more significant, as if it held secrets he had never bothered to discover. As he opened the heavy cover, a folded piece of paper fell out from between the pages, a letter written in his father's careful handwriting, sealed with wax that had long since cracked and broken. The envelope bore a single word, Everett, his hands trembling. Everett unfolded the letter and began to read. My dear son, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have inherited more than just my badge and my responsibilities. You have inherited a burden that has weighed on the Blake family for 3 generations, a secret so terrible that I prayed you would never need to know it. But the woman has come back, hasn't she? The one they call Ayanna, the last daughter of the Singing Wolf clan. I've been dreaming of her return for months now, seeing her face in my sleep, hearing her voice calling for justice across the years. I know that when she appears, the time for secrets will be over. You must understand, son, that everything you know about our family's history in Cedar Ridge is a lie. We did not arrive here as simple homesteaders seeking a better life. We came here as partners in one of the most heinous crimes ever committed in this territory, and every day we have lived here since has been paid for with innocent blood. Your great-grandfather, Josiah Blake, was the 4th partner in the conspiracy that founded this town. He was not one of the 3 families whose names appear on the official documents because he was the one who arranged for the official documents to be falsified. As a territorial administrator, he had the power to make the massacre of the Singing Wolf clan disappear from all legal records, to make it seem as if the land had been legally purchased rather than stolen through murder. In exchange for this service, Josiah received a full quarter share in all the silver that was extracted from the sacred mines of Ayanna's people. The wealth that built this town, the prosperity that has sustained our families for 80 years, was purchased with the lives of an entire clan of innocent people. I know this because Josiah kept detailed records of the conspiracy, hidden in the family Bible you now hold. Between the pages of Genesis, you will find his confession, written in his own hand and signed in his own blood. He documented everything, the planning of the attack, the division of the spoils, the disposal of the bodies, and the cover-up that followed. But most importantly, he documented the curse that Ayanna placed on our families before she died in that avalanche. She bound her spirit to this land and vowed that no descendant of the murderers would know peace until justice was served. She cursed our bloodlines to carry the weight of our ancestors' crimes, to suffer the same fear and helplessness that her people had suffered in their final moments. For 3 generations, that curse has been slowly destroying us from within. My father died young, consumed by guilt and night terrors he could never explain. I've lived my entire life haunted by dreams of violence and death, knowing that somehow, someday, impayment would be demanded for our family's sins. And now that day has come. Ayana has returned to collect the debt our family owes, and I fear there is only one way to satisfy her hunger for justice. The stolen silver must be returned to its sacred resting place. The truth about the massacre must be acknowledged publicly, and someone from each of the guilty bloodlines must pay the ultimate price for their ancestors' crimes. I had hoped to spare you this burden, had prayed that I might find another way to break the curse before my death. But time has run out, and the choice now falls to you. You can continue to hide behind the comfortable lies our family has lived with for 80 years. Or you can do what I never had the courage to do, stand up and face the consequences of our inherited guilt. I know what I am asking of you, son. I know the price that justice demands. But consider the alternative. If the curse is not broken, if Ayana's thirst for vengeance is not satisfied, then every innocent person in Cedar Ridge will suffer for the crimes they had no part in committing. The choice is yours, but choose quickly. Ayana has been patient for longer than any spirit should have to be, and her patience is finally at an end. Your father, Marshal Thomas Blake. The letter slipped from Everett's numb fingers as the full weight of revelation crashed down upon him. Everything he had believed about his family, about his own identity, about his place in Cedar Ridge's history was a lie. He was not the descendant of honest pioneers. He was the heir to murderers and conspirators who had built their legacy on the bones of innocent people. With shaking hands, he turned to the book of Genesis in the family Bible and found what his father had promised would be there. Pages of detailed documentation in his great-grandfather's spidery handwriting. A complete confession of the conspiracy that had destroyed the Singing Wolf clan. The account was methodical and chilling. Josiah Blake had documented everything with the precision of a man who understood that someday someone would need to know the truth. He described the planning meetings held in secret, the decision to eliminate the native inhabitants rather than negotiate with them, the cold-blooded execution of the plan on that February night in 1847, but the most horrifying part was Josiah's description of Ayana's final moments. She had not died in the avalanche as everyone believed. She had been captured by the conspirators and brought before them as they debated what to do with the soul. Witness to their crime, she stood before us with the dignity of a queen, Josiah had written, showing no fear even as we discussed her execution. When Caldwell raised his gun to shoot her, she spoke words in her native tongue that seemed to burn themselves into our very souls. The temperature in the room dropped so suddenly that ice formed on the windows, and we could see our breath in the air. Then she spoke in English, and her words have haunted me every day since. You have taken everything from my people, but you have not taken our justice. I bind my spirit to this land and call upon the ancient powers to witness your crime. No peace will come to your bloodlines until the truth is told. The stolen silver is returned, and the price is paid in the blood of the guilty. She pulled something from her shirt, a medallion made of sacred silver, carved with symbols older than memory. As she held it aloft, it began to glow with its own inner light, and we could feel power radiating from it like heat from a forge. Then she pressed the medallion against her heart and spoke words of binding that seemed to tear at the fabric of reality itself. The light grew brighter and brighter until we had to shield our eyes, and when it faded, Ayana was gone. In her place stood a pillar of silver light that pulsed like a heartbeat before dissolving into nothingness. We never found her body, though we searched for weeks. But I know she did not truly die that night. She transformed herself into something else, something that could wait as long as necessary for justice to be served. Everett closed the Bible and sat in stunned silence, trying to process the magnitude of what he had learned. He was not an innocent lawman caught up in supernatural events beyond his understanding. He was a direct descendant of the conspiracy that had created those events, and his family's blood was as guilty as any. The woman in his jail was not just seeking justice for her murdered people, she was seeking justice against him personally, against his bloodline. against the legacy of violence and deception that had shaped his entire life without his knowledge. And now, finally, he understood why Crawford and the other marshals before him had disappeared. They had all been offered the same choice that now faced him: help Ayanna achieve justice, or become another casualty in her decades-long war against the guilty. The question was simple: did he have the courage to do what his father and grandfather had been too afraid to do? Could he find a way to break the curse that had poisoned his family for 3 generations, even if it cost him everything he had ever believed about himself? From the jail cells, he could hear Ayanna's voice rising in that haunting musical chant that seemed to call to powers older than human memory. And for the first time since this nightmare began, Everett Blake understood exactly what she was summoning and why. The dawn of the 10th day brought with it an ominous stillness that settled over Cedar Ridge like a shroud. The wind had died completely during the night, leaving the air so motionless that smoke from chimneys rose in perfectly straight columns before dispersing into the grey sky. Even the birds had fallen silent, as if every living thing sensed that something momentous was about to unfold. Everett had not slept. He had spent the entire night wrestling with the terrible knowledge contained in his father's letter and his great-grandfather's confession, trying to find some path forward that would not lead to catastrophe for everyone he had sworn to protect. But every scenario he imagined ended in death and destruction, and he was beginning to understand that some debts could only be paid in blood. He found Ayanna sitting cross-legged in the center of her cell, her eyes closed and her hands resting on what he now knew was the sacred silver medallion, the same one his great-grandfather had described in his confession. The medallion seemed to pulse with its own inner light, casting shifting shadows on the cell walls that moved independently of any natural illumination. "You read it," she said without opening her eyes. "Your father's letter, your great-grandfather's confession. How did you—" Everett began, then stopped himself. After everything he had witnessed, the idea that she might somehow know his thoughts was no longer surprising. "I have been waiting for this moment for 80 years, Ayanna replied, finally opening her eyes to look at him. "Waiting for one of the guilty bloodlines to acknowledge the truth, to accept responsibility for the crimes that built this town." Everett studied her face, looking for some sign of the young woman who had witnessed her family's slaughter all those decades ago. But time seemed to have touched her differently than it touched normal human beings. Her features held the same youthful beauty described in his great-grandfather's account. Unmarked by the passage of years. "What happens now?" he asked. "What do you need from me to end this?" Ayanna rose from her sitting position with fluid grace and moved to the barred window that looked out over the town. From this vantage point, she could see the entire main street of Cedar Ridge, the buildings that had been constructed with silver stolen from her people's sacred mines. 3 things must be accomplished before justice can be satisfied, she said, her voice carrying the weight of ancient ritual. First, the truth about the massacre must be acknowledged publicly, so that the spirits of my people can finally know that their deaths have been witnessed and remembered. That can be arranged, Everett said, though he knew the reaction it would provoke among the town's residents. What's the second thing? The stolen silver, all of it that remains, must be returned to the sacred grove where my people were murdered. It must be restored to the earth from which it was taken, so that the land can begin to heal from the violation it has suffered. Everett's heart sank. The silver extracted from the mines over the past 80 years had built the entire economic foundation of Cedar Ridge. It had been turned into coins, jewelry, decorative objects, industrial tools. Tracking down and recovering all of it would be virtually impossible. And the third thing? He asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Ayanna turned from the window to face him, and in her eyes he saw the accumulated grief and rage of 8 decades waiting for justice. Someone from each of the 4 guilty bloodlines must pay the ultimate price for their ancestors' crimes. Blood calls to blood across the generations, and only blood can satisfy the debt that was incurred that night. 4 bloodlines. Everett felt a chill of recognition. Caldwell, Henderson, Morrison, and Blake. Your great-grandfather was the architect of the cover-up, Ayana confirmed. Without his falsification of the territorial records, the other 3 could never have claimed legal ownership of our land. In many ways, his crime was the greatest of all. The weight of inherited guilt pressed down on Everett's shoulders like a physical burden. He thought of all the years he had spent maintaining the peace in Cedar Ridge, believing he was serving justice, never knowing that his very presence was a mockery of everything justice represented. The people who would pay this price, he said carefully. They had nothing to do with what happened 80 years ago. They're innocent of their ancestors' crimes, are they? Ayana's voice carried a note of cold challenge. Your Mayor Caldwell has spent his entire political career suppressing any investigation into the town's origins, using his influence to keep certain historical documents sealed. Doc Henderson has quietly destroyed medical records that might have raised questions about mysterious deaths over the years. The Morrison family has systematically bought up any land that might contain evidence of the original massacre. She moved closer to the cell bars, and Everett could feel the supernatural power radiating from her like heat from a forge. And you, Marshal Blake, have spent 40 years enforcing laws that were written to protect the guilty while ignoring the cries of the dead. None of you are as innocent as you pretend to be, but there has to be another way, Everett protested. Some other form of justice that doesn't require more death. There is, Ayana said quietly. The bloodlines can choose to sacrifice themselves willingly, acknowledging their guilt and accepting the consequences. If they do this, if they face justice with courage, instead of hiding behind fear and denial, then their deaths will break the curse permanently and protect all the innocent people in this town. And if they refuse, Ayana's expression hardened, then I will take them by force, and the innocent will suffer alongside the guilty. The spirits of my people grow more restless with each passing day. Their patience has limits, and those limits have been reached. As if to emphasize her words, the temperature in the jail began to drop precipitously. Ice formed on the metal bars, and their breath began to mist in the suddenly frigid air. Through the barred window, Everett could see unnatural shadows moving through the town, shapes that resembled human figures but cast no shadows of their own. How long do we have? He asked. Until sunset tonight, Ayana replied. That will mark 10 days since my return to this place, the same number of days my people camped in the valley before they were murdered. If justice is not served by then, the spirits will take matters into their own hands. Everett felt the crushing weight of an impossible decision settling on his shoulders. He could try to convince the other bloodlines to accept their fate willingly, knowing that they would probably refuse and demand that he arrest or execute Ayana instead. He could attempt to flee the town with as many innocent people as possible, though he doubted they would get far before supernatural forces caught up with them. Or he could accept his own guilt and face the consequences alone, hoping that his sacrifice might somehow satisfy the debt his family owed. There's something else you need to know, Ayana said, as if reading his thoughts. The sacred medallion I carry contains the bound spirits of my murdered clan. If I am killed before justice is served, they will be released all at once, and their combined rage will destroy everything within 50 miles of this place. There will be no escape, no mercy, no survival for anyone. The trap was perfect, Everett realized. Any attempt to solve the problem through violence would only make it infinitely worse. The only path forward was through justice, and justice demanded a price that would tear apart everything he had spent his life trying to protect. I need time to think, he said. Time to figure out the best way to handle this. You have until sunset, Ayana repeated. Use the time wisely. As Everett left the jail and walked out onto the main street of Cedar Ridge, he could see the fear in the faces of the townspeople going about their morning routines. They sensed that something terrible was approaching, even if they didn't understand exactly what it was. The supernatural phenomena of the past week had shaken their faith in the natural order of things, and the disappearances of Tommy Morrison and Doc Henderson had made it clear that whatever was happening was deadly serious. He looked at the buildings around him: the general store run by the Caldwell family, the medical practice where the Henderson family had served the community for 3 generations, the mining office that had processed claims for the Morrison family's operations. All of it built on blood money, all of it sustained by a lie that had grown more elaborate and entrenched with each passing year. But he also saw the innocent people who called Cedar Ridge home, the shopkeepers and miners, the wives and children, the elderly folks who had lived here their entire lives, believing they were part of a legitimate, law-abiding community. They deserved protection, deserved to be shielded from the consequences of crimes they had never committed. The question that haunted him was simple and terrible. How could he serve justice for the dead without destroying the lives of the living? How could he balance the scales of cosmic justice when any action he took would result in tragedy for someone? As the day wore on and the sun tracked its inexorable path across the sky toward evening, Everett found himself walking the streets of Cedar Ridge like a condemned man measuring the dimensions of his cell. Every familiar sight, the schoolhouse where children learned to read, the church where families gathered for worship, the cemetery where generations of residents lay buried, reminded him of what was at stake. By late afternoon, he had made his decision. It was not a good decision, not a decision that would leave everyone happy or safe, but it was the only decision he could live with, the only choice that offered any hope of breaking the cycle of violence and retribution that had poisoned his town for 80 years. As the sun began to set behind the western mountains, casting Cedar Ridge into shadow, Marshal Everett Blake walked back to the jail to face the woman who held the power to destroy or redeem everything he had ever cared about. The sacred grove lay hidden in a narrow valley 5 miles north of Cedar Ridge, accessible only by a treacherous mountain trail that wound between towering granite cliffs. Everett had never seen it before, but Ayanna led him there with the certainty of someone returning home after a long absence. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the air grew thinner and colder, and the familiar sounds of the town faded into silence. The only sounds were their footsteps on the rocky path and the whisper of wind through the pine trees that clung to the steep slopes. But there was something else, a presence that seemed to move with them, invisible companions that made the hair on the back of Everett's neck stand on end. "They're here," Ayanna said quietly, as if reading his thoughts. "The spirits of my people. They've been waiting for this day longer than you can imagine." The trail opened suddenly into a circular valley, perhaps a quarter-mile across, surrounded on all sides by sheer rock walls that rose like cathedral spires toward the darkening sky. Natural hot springs bubbled up from the earth in several places, creating pools of steaming water that caught the last rays of sunset and threw them back in shimmering patterns. But it was the center of the valley that took Everett's breath away. There, arranged in a perfect circle, were the skeletal remains of what had once been a thriving encampment. He could see the fire-blackened stones that had marked family hearths, the posts that had supported teepees and lodges, the carefully constructed rock circles that had served as gathering places for the community, and scattered throughout the ruins, gleaming in the fading light, were fragments of silver, pieces of jewelry, decorative objects, ceremonial items that had been broken and scattered by the violence of that terrible night 80 years ago. "This is where it happened," Ayanna said, her voice heavy with grief and memory. "This is where my family, my entire clan, was murdered while they slept." Everett felt the weight of history pressing down on him as he looked around the sacred grove. The peace and beauty of the place made the violence that had occurred here seem even more obscene, a violation of something pure and holy that could never be fully healed. "The silver," he said, pointing to the scattered fragments. It was never removed from here? The murderers were afraid to touch it, Ayana explained. They knew it was sacred to my people, and they feared it might carry curses or bring bad luck. They took the silver from the mines, but they left the personal belongings of their victims to rot in the elements. She moved toward the center of the grove, where a large flat stone served as a natural altar. The rock was stained dark with what looked like old bloodstains, and carved into its surface were symbols that matched those on Ayana's medallion. "This is the heartstone of our people," she said, placing her hands reverently on its surface. "For generations, our spiritual leaders used this place to commune with the ancestors, to seek guidance and wisdom from those who had gone before." As she spoke, the temperature in the grove began to drop, and Everett could see his breath misting in the suddenly frigid air. But this time, the supernatural cold brought with it something else, visible manifestations of the spirits Ayana had summoned. They appeared gradually, like figures emerging from a thick fog. Men and women of all ages, children and elders, all bearing the wounds that had killed them on that terrible night. They moved with the fluid grace of smoke-given form, and their eyes burned with the same silver fire that flickered in Ayana's medallion. "My people," Ayana whispered, tears streaming down her face. "My family. They have been waiting so long for this moment." The spirits arranged themselves in a circle around the altar stone, their forms becoming more solid and distinct as the last light faded from the sky. Everett could see the family resemblances, could understand, from their positioning and interactions, the complex web of relationships that had bound the Singing Wolf clan together. At the head of the spirit circle stood an elderly man whose bearing and regalia marked him as the clan's chief. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of generations of leadership and the wisdom of the ancestors. "The debt will be paid tonight," he said, his words echoing strangely in the enclosed valley. "The blood that was spilled here will be answered for, and the sacred silver will be restored to its rightful place." Everett felt the crushing weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders as he realized that everything he had feared was about to come to pass. The spirits were not interested in mercy or compromise. They wanted justice, and justice required a price that he was not sure he was prepared to pay. "What do you need from me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ayana removed the sacred medallion from around her neck and held it up so that it caught the ethereal light emanating from the assembled spirits. The silver began to glow with increasing intensity, and Everett could feel power radiating from it like heat from a forge. "You must choose," she said simply. "Honor or cowardice, justice or continued lies. The redemption of your bloodline or the damnation of your entire town." The spirits pressed closer, their eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his soul feel naked and exposed. In their gaze, he could see not just hunger for vengeance, but a desperate hope that finally, after 8 decades of waiting, someone would have the courage to do what was right. The moment of final decision had arrived, and there was no more time for doubt or delay. Everett Blake reached for the chain around his neck. Not the badge he had worn for 40 years, but something far older and more significant. Hidden beneath his shirt, he had carried his great-grandfather's final confession, written on parchment, and sealed in a silver locket that had been passed down through 3 generations of guilty men. "I choose justice," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I choose to break the cycle of lies and violence that has poisoned my family for 80 years. The assembled spirits stirred, their forms becoming more solid and defined as hope flickered in their ethereal eyes. But Ayana studied his face carefully, as if searching for signs of deception or cowardice. "What are you prepared to sacrifice for this justice?" she asked. Everett opened the silver locket and removed the parchment inside, his great-grandfather's final testimony, written in his own blood and detailing every aspect of the conspiracy that had destroyed the Singing Wolf clan. "Everything," he said simply. "My life, my reputation, my family's legacy. All of it. He held the confession aloft so that both Ayana and the spirits could see it clearly. This document contains the complete truth about what happened here. Names, dates, methods, everything needed to expose the conspiracy and acknowledge the crimes that were committed. The spirit of the clan chief moved closer, his eyes fixed on the blood-stained parchment. You would destroy your own family's honor to restore justice to mine. My family has no honor, Everett replied with painful honesty. We forfeited that right the night we participated in the murder of innocent people. But perhaps, if I can find the courage my father and grandfather lacked, we can at least die with dignity. Ayana stepped closer to him, the sacred medallion still glowing in her hands. There is another way, she said softly. A path that might preserve some lives while still serving justice. What kind of path? The binding ritual that created my curse can be modified, she explained. Instead of demanding the death of all 4 bloodlines, it can be satisfied by a willing sacrifice from the primary conspirator's line, your line, combined with a public acknowledgement of guilt from the others. Everett felt a flicker of hope, quickly tempered by caution. What kind of willing sacrifice? Your life force, freely given, to power the ritual that will return the stolen silver to the earth and release the spirits of my people. But also your commitment to serve as guardian of this sacred place, to ensure that the truth is never forgotten again. The implications were staggering. She was offering him a chance to save the other bloodlines, to protect the innocent people of Cedar Ridge, but the price would be his own existence as a normal human being. I would become like you, he asked. Bound to this place, sustained by supernatural forces, living between the world of the living and the dead, for as long as necessary to ensure justice is maintained, Ayana confirmed. It might be decades, or it might be centuries, but you would be protecting both the living and the dead, ensuring that the crimes of the past are never repeated. Everett looked around the sacred grove, at the ruins of a peaceful community that had been destroyed by greed and hatred. He thought of Cedar Ridge, of the innocent people who would suffer if the spirit's full vengeance was unleashed. He thought of his own life, 63 years of believing he was serving justice while actually perpetuating injustice. The other bloodlines, he said, what would happen to them? They would face public judgment for their ancestors' crimes, Ayana replied. They would be required to return all wealth derived from stolen silver, to acknowledge their guilt publicly, and to make restitution to any surviving members of the native tribes in the region. But they would live. It was not perfect justice, the kind of cosmic balance that would satisfy every wrong that had been committed. But it was a compromise that might prevent further bloodshed while still honoring the memory of those who had been murdered. And if I refuse this bargain? Everett asked, though he already knew the answer. The spirits pressed closer, their forms crackling with barely contained energy. The temperature dropped so low that ice began forming on the rocks around them, and in the distance, Everett could hear the sound of supernatural winds rising, the harbinger of the storm that would destroy Cedar Ridge if justice was not served. Then my people will take what is owed to them, Ayana said simply, and nothing will be left standing to remember either the guilty or the innocent. Everett closed his eyes and thought of Martha at her saloon, of the children playing in the schoolyard, of all the people who had built lives in Cedar Ridge without knowing the terrible foundation those lives rested upon. They deserved a chance to live free from the sins of the past. He opened his eyes and met Ayana's gaze directly. I accept your terms. Take my life to power your ritual, bind me to this place as its guardian, but spare the innocent and give the guilty a chance to make amends. The sacred medallion in Ayana's hands flared with brilliant silver light, and the spirits of the singing wolf clan began to sing, a haunting, beautiful melody that seemed to call forth the very essence of life itself. The ritual of justice and redemption had finally begun. 3 months later, the new town charter of Cedar Ridge bore little resemblance to the document that had governed the community for 80 years. written in careful script on parchment that would age far more slowly than ordinary paper. It began with words that would have been unthinkable just a season before. We, the residents of Cedar Ridge, Colorado Territory, do hereby acknowledge the terrible crimes committed by our founding families against the Singing Wolf Clan in February of 1847. And we commit ourselves to honoring the memory of those who were murdered and making restitution for the sins of our predecessors. Mayor Caldwell, or rather, former Mayor Caldwell, had signed his name to the document with a shaking hand. His political career ended, but his life spared through Everett's sacrifice. The silver mine that had made his family wealthy for 3 generations was now sealed permanently. Its entrance marked with a memorial stone carved with the names of every member of the Singing Wolf Clan who had perished that terrible night. Doc Henderson's nephew had taken over the medical practice, after Henderson himself had chosen exile over the public shame of acknowledging his family's guilt. The Morrison family had sold their remaining claims and left the territory entirely unable to bear the weight of community judgment. But they lived, and their children would grow up knowing the truth rather than perpetuating the lies that had poisoned 3 generations. Martha Kowalski stood in the doorway of her saloon, watching the afternoon sun paint the mountains in shades of gold and amber. The building had been renamed the Sacred Grove, and above the entrance hung a wooden sign carved with symbols that honored the memory of the murdered clan. It served the same function it always had, a gathering place for the community. But now that community was built on truth rather than comfortable deception, the changes in Cedar Ridge went deeper than new names and altered histories. The supernatural phenomena that had plagued the town during those terrifying 10 days had ceased completely once Everett completed his bargain with Ayanna. The temperature fluctuations stopped, the mysterious voices fell silent, and the unnatural shadows that had moved through the streets at night disappeared forever. But perhaps the most significant change was in the people themselves. The revelation of their town's dark origins had shattered many comfortable assumptions, forcing residents to confront the reality that prosperity built on injustice was no prosperity at all. Some families had chosen to leave, unable to reconcile themselves to living in a place with such a blood-soaked history. Others had stayed and committed themselves to building something better from the ashes of their broken illusions. A small school had been established to teach the local native languages, ensuring that the culture of the Singing Wolf Clan would not be entirely lost to time. Children who had grown up knowing only the sanitized version of their town's history were now learning the names and traditions of the people who had lived in the valley before them. The hot springs in the Sacred Grove had become a place of pilgrimage for native peoples from throughout the territory, a site where the spirits of the murdered could finally rest in peace. And watching over it all, ensuring that the truth would never again be buried beneath convenient lies, was a figure that visitors sometimes glimpsed among the trees, a tall man in worn clothing who seemed to belong to no particular time or place. Those who had known him in life recognized Marshal Everett Blake, though he appeared younger than his 63 years and moved with a fluid grace that spoke of supernatural enhancement. He had kept his bargain with Ayanna, trading his normal human existence for the role of eternal guardian, protecting both the living and the dead from the kind of violence and deception that had once torn the community apart. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind was right, visitors to the Sacred Grove reported hearing voices speaking in the old language, not the angry, demanding tones that had terrified Cedar Ridge during those 10 days of reckoning, but peaceful conversations between old friends, the sounds of a family reunited after decades of painful separation. Ayanna herself had not been seen since the night of the binding ritual, but her presence could be felt throughout the valley. The carved symbols on rocks and trees had stopped appearing in ominous contexts and instead seemed to serve as protective wards, marking safe paths through the wilderness and warning travelers away from dangerous areas. The sacred silver that had been stolen from the mines had been returned to the earth through methods that no one in Cedar Ridge fully understood. What they did know was that the metal had simply vanished from every bank vault, jewelry box, and decorative object in town, dissolving like morning frost when the sun rose on the morning after the ritual. In its place they found flowers, mountain, lilies that bloomed out of season and filled the air, with a fragrance that spoke of peace and forgiveness, as autumn gave way to winter and the first snows began to dust the peaks surrounding Cedar Ridge. The community settled into a new rhythm of life. It was quieter than before, more reflective, marked by an awareness of history that had been missing for 80 years. Children learned to say prayers for the dead before their meals, and adults spoke more carefully about the legacy they wanted to leave for future generations. Martha closed the saloon early that evening, as had become her custom, and walked to the small cemetery on the hill overlooking the town. There, among the weathered headstones that marked the graves of 3 generations of residents, stood a new monument, a simple granite stone that bore no names but was carved with symbols representing all the members of the Singing Wolf clan. As she stood before the memorial, Martha could have sworn she heard music carried on the evening wind, the same haunting melodies that had once terrified the town, but now seemed to offer comfort and hope. The voices of the dead were singing, not in anger or demand for vengeance, but in gratitude for the justice that had finally been served and the peace that had finally come to the valley they had loved in life. Justice had been served. The debt had been paid, and Cedar Ridge could finally begin the long process of healing from the wounds that had festered in darkness for far too long. The caged mountain woman had found her freedom, and in doing so, she had freed them all.